and welcome to today's Oil for the Journey Oil Change. I am your journey reader, Denise Joyner Mitty, and I will be presenting this oil change based on the readings from 1 Timothy chapters 4 through 6. So just an overview before we get into some practical application. This is Paul addressing Timothy, who's basically his mentee. So Paul is acting like a big brother here and is basically talking to Timothy and advising him as he would a young brother of his or a mentee of his, someone he's discipling. And it's important to know that this particular book, Timothy and some others in the Bible, are really what they call pastoral letters. And when I say they, I mean in seminary, they teach us that these letters that Paul are writing are pastoral letters, some of them, and Timothy being one of them, 1st and 2nd Timothy, because Timothy was a leader in his day in Ephesus. Timothy being young, as a leader, there were a lot of hidden dangers, and this is all new. You know, the Christian faith is all new in a pluralistic Greco-Roman society. So Paul was basically instructing him on how to live godly and how to be a godly leader. And it's worth noting that this is a letter, 1 Timothy as well as 2 Timothy, that all who are Christians, who profess the faith and indeed want to live the faith, should read and take to heart on how to live a godly life. So let's start with the fact that Paul addresses Timothy in chapters 4 through 6, dealing with different sections. Okay, so different sections or intersectionalities of life and living. So the first of chapter 4 was basically telling Timothy to be godly, and for those who are professing the faith of Christianity to be wise and not really listen to false teachers, and not at all, listen to false teachers and prophets. In that society, the Greco-Roman society, there were many people walking around with stories that they were God, if you will, or that they had answers to a prosperous life. And believe you me, it's no different than today's society. So there are different religions going on at that time. Of course, Judaism was more prominent, but even that was tainted in some regards with some sects of Jewish leaders, in that they started to take on some of the influences from the Jewish society, and that influenced them in how they conducted their leadership in early Judaism. Of course, there were Jewish sects, though, that were sticklers. They were very traditional and would not stray from the Hebraic law, from Yahweh's word at all. But to emphasize the fact that that society was filled with multicultural people, different people groups, because it was a large trade area. We can't really overlook that, because that is what produced the pluralistic nature of that society and the different religions of that time. So Paul is addressing Timothy here, his kind of younger brother, mentee, we'll say, in different sections. Chapter 4 has to do with beware of false prophets and teachers lurking about. Chapter 5 deals with widows, elders, and slaves. And chapter 6 basically deals with money and the love of it. You remember that was a very hard life of that time was a very hard time for life and living for the ancient world. And so people were consumed with trying to make more money. Does that sound familiar? So Paul was telling Timothy in chapter 6, look, Don't make money be your primary focus. Don't make it be a love, because God will take care of you. Be content with what you have. Don't try to go out and gain more money. Yes, you're preaching my gospel, and since you're preaching my gospel, you will be honored, you will be taken care of. So don't worry about, making large sums of money or even living like the wealthy do. Remember, this was a classist society, and so there was the rich and the poor class, basically those two classes. And everyone, of course, on the latter side was trying to be rich. And then smuggled in there between chapters 4 and 6 is chapter 5, which deals with really relationships with widows, elders, and slaves. He's basically saying to Timothy, look, you got to respect your elders and treat widows or even young women as your sisters, young men as your brothers, meaning as your fleshly brother and sister. That's how you're to relate to other women and other men, and seek to learn from those who are your elders and respect them. And widows in that time was very popular because, again, they didn't have modern conventions or modern medicine, if you will, to keep most of the men alive. There were wars as well that also constituted the low mortality rates of men in early ancient Israel society. And so with that being said, there were a lot of widows. And since men were the primary providers for homes, widows were they were very poor and either looking to the church to care for them, or they were going to remarry and look for another man to care for them. Largely, they also had children. So Paul was basically telling Timothy how to manage that situation. If it was a widow that was potentially wanting to remarry and she was going to remarry, don't worry too much about her being provided for financially or even practically in terms of food and clothing and shelter. But if there was a widow that was totally without, no resources available, no man to hook her up in that day and age, it was the church's responsibility to do that. So he was looking to give practical leadership advice to Timothy on how to deal with these vast and prominent relationships in society. Widows, elders, and slaves being the last one. Remember, we're not dealing with chattel slavery here, because that basically was not occurring during that time. In that time, people were slaves really because of debt and how to pay off a debt. So if they were indebted to someone for whatever reason, they became their slave to help pay off that debt. So that was how that society was run, much imputed by the Romans. Remember, in our Lord's Prayer, we say, forgive us our trespasses. Sometimes that word is translated, and I know especially with Catholicism, as debts. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And this was very important during that time because there were a lot of slaves, and they were slaves because they were in debt a lot. So basically, Timothy was being instructed by Paul on how to instruct those who were slaves, and basically to respect your masters, whether they were Christian or not, to respect them and to honor them as your masters, because you were serving them as if you were serving Christ by respecting your masters. So in this particular text, it's a lot, but just remember that Timothy was a leader early in the Christian faith, and he was being instructed by his mentor, if you will, Paul, on how to lead this group of people in a pluralistic society, plagued also with many ills, social ills, widows being one of them, the poverty of widows, the poverty of the elders, yet the wisdom of the elders, and the poverty of the slaves. And so when we are approaching this for our own application as believers, we're to remember that all of us, technically, if we're preaching the gospel, teaching the gospel, and leading gospel-filled lives, God-centered lives, we are leaders whether we like it or not. We are being watched whether we like it or not. So thank you for joining me today for this Oil for the Journey oil change, and may God continue to richly bless and keep you.